Hi guys, Daniel Gangur here. Welcome to my channel. Now in this video I'm going to show you how I post-process Milky Way images. Now we're going to keep it fairly basic in this video. I'd like it to kind of help you build a bit of a foundation with your own post-processing and be something that we can build on in future videos. Now I'm going to make the images available for download. You'll be able to find them in the description of this video. And you'll also be able to find them over on my website, Nightscape Photographer. Anyway, let's get into it. Welcome back. We're now in Adobe Lightroom. So as mentioned in the intro, in this video I'm going to show you how I post-process Milky Way images. Now we're going to keep it pretty simple here, and the reason behind that is I'd like this to be a bit of a foundation for your post-processing and something that we can build on in future videos. Now before we get into the post-processing, let's talk a little bit about the image that we'll be using. So we'll be using this image here. You'll be able to download this image via a link in the description of this video if you'd like to work along. This is a straight out of camera RAW file, and by the end of this video we're going to make it look something like this. Now, a question I'm often asked is what my images look like straight out of camera. So this image here is straight out of camera. Now, I guess people ask that question because they head out and take photos themselves, and they don't quite end up looking like the images that you see shared on social media. Now, some of that has to do with the post-processing, but a lot of it also has to do with what we do at time of capture. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So in this image, you can see that I've got quite a fair bit of detail in the Milky Way. Now, I live in an area that I've got quite dark skies, and that's why I can get that detail. Now, if you lived in the city, you're going to really struggle to get detail like that purely because of all the light pollution. So with your Milky Way images, you really need to get away from the light pollution and find some dark skies. Now, the other thing I do with my images is I used a bit of external lighting to light all this foreground. Now, if I didn't do that, the foreground would be pretty dark and in silhouette, like we see here and over here. So I generally use a couple of small lights. I like to use lume cubes, and for this image here I've used a lume cube over here on the left on a tripod, just on a low setting to put a little bit of light in this area here. You can see the light on the bush, you can see the light on the side of the building. Now I've also used a lume cube over to the right, and it was out here somewhere, probably about 25-30 meters away from the building, and it was in a higher setting than the other lume cube. It was also up on a tripod, and I used that really as my main light on the subject there. So that's what I did at time of capture for this image. Let's talk a little bit about the settings that I used. Now, if we head over to the top right hand corner of the screen, we can see the settings that I used for this particular image. I used an ISO of 6400, a focal length of 14mm, an f-stop of f2.8, and a shutter speed of 20 seconds. Now, if you're wondering why I used those particular settings, I have written a blog about this over on my website, Nightscape Photographer. I'll link that in the description of this video. So now we've got all that out of the way, let's get into the post-processing. So the first thing I'd do here is I'd create a copy of the image. So I'd head down to the bottom left-hand corner. I'm on a Mac, so I'd hit Control and the mouse button, and I'd create a virtual copy. So we now have a copy of that image. Now the reason I do this is so that I'm working on the copy with my post-processing. And if I make any mistakes, I can just delete it. Now, my next step would be to come over to this panel on the right, scroll all the way to the top, and I'd start working down this panel and making adjustments. So this image is quite flat. It's a raw file, so we can't see a lot of color in there. It does need a little bit of work. So over on this panel here, what we'd start looking at is boosting the color in this image. So we can see this Adobe color. I'm going to leave it like that for now. But I'm going to head down to the vibrance and saturation. Now I'm going to use the saturation slider to bring in a little bit more color to the image. Just crank that up so you guys can see it at 38 point, and I'm also going to add a bit more vibrance. Now, as you can see, that's already made a huge difference to the image. It's brought in a lot of color to the foreground, a little bit of color to the sky and everything like that. The image is looking much better just with those little tweaks. Now, for my Milky Way photography, I generally use a white balance between about this 4200K and 4600K. Now, I like the 4200K on this image, and I'm going to leave it like that, but I am going to show you the difference that different white balances make to the image. So if we go with something like a 3800K white balance, we've introduced a fair bit of blue to the image. It's cooled the image down, and sometimes this really suits your night photography images, but I'm not going to use it in this case. Now, if we slide our slider to the right and use something like 6000K, you can see that the image is quite warm now, and it just doesn't look very good. So I'm going to drop this white balance back down to the 4200K. So I quite like that for this image. We'll get close enough. There we go. And I think that looks the most natural for this image. Now, next I'd have a look at these sliders here. The first thing that I'd probably work with is the shadows. I'd lift the shadows a little bit. You probably can't see the difference that's making in the video, but it is making a little bit of difference here on the screen that I can see. Now, we don't want to overdo this, and I'll show you why. If we go too hard on the shadows, we really rip this image apart. It looks terrible. So we don't want to go too hard on the shadows. I'm just going to give it a little bit of a boost. Now, I'd also look at adjusting the whites. This will boost the brighter parts of the image a little bit, as we can see. So it's made this area a little bit brighter. That's all I do up here within this panel. Now I'll scroll down the side panel here, and the next thing that I'd do is I'd do a little bit of sharpening. So I generally use a value of about 40 with my sharpening, but I do like to mask that sharpening. So again, I'm on a Mac, so I'm going to hit Option. I'm going to mouse click on the mask. And what I'm doing here is I'm selectively sharpening the areas that are white. So the main area of focus in this image. So I think I'll leave it there. So I've selectively sharpened the building here. Now next I'd look at doing a little bit of noise reduction. Now before I'd do the noise reduction, I'd generally zoom up on one of these shadowy areas. Let's zoom up here. And I'd have a look at what it looks like noise-wise. Now it's looking pretty good. It probably doesn't even need any noise reduction, but we will add it for the sake of the video. I use the Canon EOS R and it performs fantastic at high ISO. So we'll give it a little bit of noise reduction, but we won't overdo it. Now, you probably can't even really see the difference that made. Now let's zoom back out again. And let's keep scrolling down the panel. So we're down to this lens correction. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to select manual lens correction. We're going to do a bit of defringing. Now if we zoom up on some of these stars, we can see that they've got a little bit of a purple edge to them. Now I'm going to remove that with defringing. Now I'm just going to use a value of 1, and that's just taken the color off the edge of those stars. Now we don't want to overdo the defringe, and I'll show you why. It just makes a mess of our image if we overdo it. So all we're aiming for there is to take that little bit of purple fringe off the stars. So we'll zoom back out. So now our image here in Lightroom is looking pretty good. That's all that we do in Lightroom at this point in time. So what I do here is I'd head back down to the bottom left hand corner, and I'd use Control, click the mouse button, and now we're going to edit this in Adobe Photoshop. So this might take a few seconds to open. Okay, now we have our image open in Photoshop. So what we're going to do here in Photoshop is we are going to increase the detail here in the Milky Way. So the first thing that we want to do here is head down to the bottom right hand corner, and we want to create a curves layer. So you can see that there. Next we want to head up to the top left hand corner, and we want to select a brush, well, the brush tool. So we'll select that. Before we go any further, we want to make sure that this foreground layer is set to black and this background layer is set to white. Now up here we can see our brush settings. If we have a look here, you can see that I have my flow set to 3%. Now that's pretty important. The reason I have it set so low like that is so that the brush isn't too harsh when we use it. Now if we look at the center of the screen, we can see our brush tool. Now we can use the square brackets on the keyboard to resize the brush tool. So the right square bracket makes it bigger, the left square bracket makes it smaller. We're going to make this brush about this size here, about the size of this darker portion of the Milky Way, and you'll see why shortly. Now, if we click the backslash key and we start painting into this image, we can see where we're painting. Now, I'm just going to paint in along all that darker sort of lane, I guess, in the core of the Milky Way. You'll see why in a second. Now what we'll do here is we'll also resize our brush. We'll make it smaller, so the left square bracket, and that way we can brush into some of these areas here also. Now you could do this all day and you could get into all these little lanes and darker areas of the image, but we're not going to go overboard in this video. Okay, so you can see where we've painted in. If we head over to the layer now and we click on the layer mask, we can then come up and press invert, come down to this icon here, and now we have a curve up here in the side panel. So have a look at what happens to that area that we just painted in when I play with this curve. We can darken it and we can lighten it. So we've got a lot of control in that area that we just painted. So what I want to do here is I just want to darken it up a little bit and bring in a little bit of contrast through the center of the Milky Way core there. So next what we're going to do is we are going to create another curve layer. There we go, another curve layer. Now this time we're going to select a bigger brush, so that right square bracket. We're going to select a bigger brush like this. We're going to hit that backslash again so we can see where we're painting. And we're going to paint through all this area, and we're going to try and blend it out a little bit further this time. Now that's probably enough. We'll head back over to our curves on the right hand side, our curve layer. Click on that mask, invert it, come back down, and we have another curve up here to play with. So this time that curve's going to affect a larger portion of the Milky Way, that area that we just painted in. So let's have a bit of a play around. Now look at that. If we take the top half of the curve, see how it affects the brighter part of the Milky Way. So I'm going to make a bit of an S curve there. So what we've done there is we've darkened off the center portion of that Milky Way again and lightened the lighter areas, and that's created a bit more contrast there. So we could keep going, creating curves, layers, and adjusting all the various spots in the Milky Way that we want to increase detail. But for the sake of the tutorial, we're only going to do 2 curves layers. But what we're going to do next is we're going to head down again, and we're going to create another layer. But this time we're going to create a color balance layer. So you can see here in the Milky Way that we've got a little bit of yellow color through the core of the Milky Way. So we're going to try and enhance that a bit. But first we're going to take our big brush, we're going to backslash again so we can see where we paint, and we're going to paint in over the Milky Way again. All right, that's enough. All right, we'll head back over to our layer and our layer mask, click it, invert this icon, and now we have our color balance options. So we could play around with our shadows, midtones, and highlights. I'm going to stick to the midtones, and I only want to adjust the yellow, that color that we can see there in the Milky Way. But first we're going to go pretty extreme with this to show you what happens. We're going to take the yellow all the way to the left, and it looks terrible. It's overkill. We don't want that. So we're going to bring this back, and we're just going to introduce a little bit more yellow, make it a little bit more yellow there. I think that's probably plenty, about that 11. So let's just bring a little bit more yellow through the core of the Milky Way. So we've done a few adjustments here on the Milky Way to bring out a little bit more detail. So if we head back over to our layers over here, we can have a look at what we've done. We'll turn these layers off. And you can see we've made quite a big difference to that Milky Way. And it's looking pretty good. We've pulled a lot more detail out of that Milky Way and increased the contrast and all that kind of thing. So our next step here would be to flatten down these layers. So we'll head up to layer and we'll flatten the image. So now for the sake of this video, we are now finished in Photoshop. So we'll save this image, head up to File, Save As. I like to use the Photoshop file, so the PSD, and we're going to change this to say House PS, so House Photoshop, and we're going to save this. Once it's saved, we're going to minimize Photoshop. Okay, so we saved our image, we minimized Photoshop, and we're now back in Lightroom. If we pop down to the bottom left-hand corner, we can see that we have an image selected. This is our House PS file. This is the image that we just saved in Photoshop. Now, if you have a look at it, the image here, it does look pretty good. we could just save this as our final image and be done with it. But there's still a few things that I'd like to do here in Lightroom. So next in my workflow, I'd usually crop the image. The reason why I'd crop an image is to balance the composition up. Now with this image here, the composition's pretty good, so I'm not going to crop this actual image. I just want to mention that for the video. Now if we head over to the panel on the right, we're going to work down that again. I'm going to add a little bit more saturation. Not too much, we don't want to overdo it. I'm going to keep scrolling down this panel until we come to sharpening. So I know that we've already sharpened, but I want to do it again. We're going to go very easy on that sharpening, and we're going to mask it. So again on the Mac, Option, and we'll scroll across, and what we've done there is selectively sharpened the building. Now we'll keep scrolling down. I'm not going to add any more noise reduction, no more lens correction, but we are going to head down to the post-crop vignetting. So the image has quite a bit of natural vignette, but we are going to add a little bit more. We're going to be pretty gentle with it. Going to move the midpoint all the way to the left and the feather all the way to the right. Now the reason why I add a bit of post-crop vignetting is just to help draw your eye to the subject, to the center of the frame. From here, we could scroll back up and we could play with the exposure to bring the exposure up in the center of the frame as well. But because this image is taken at night, I quite like it the way that it is, just that little bit darker and a little bit moody. So anyway, that's our final image. That's how I'd post-process my Milky Way images. Now, the next step from here would be just to save the image, and I'd save it in a couple of different ways. I'd save a small file with a watermark so that I could share that on social media. I'd save a large JPEG, and I'd save a large TIFF, just so I had them in the future if I needed them. I really hope that you enjoyed this video and you learnt something from it. If you did like this video, please subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. Anyway, we'll leave it there, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.